An underwater drone dropped into a muddy Alabama river and found a wooden hull that had been hiding since 1860, deliberately burned and sunk by its own captain to destroy the only evidence of a crime. This is the Clotilda, the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to American soil, more than 50 years after Congress made that trade illegal. For 160 years, one family carried this story with no proof at all, just memory passed down mouth to mouth. When the cameras finally reached the bottom of that river, what they found left the research team in the room completely silent. Stay with me through this one, because the ending of this story is still being written right now, with DNA tests that haven't come back yet, and you're going to want to know how it turns out. Subscribe now, because this is real history, and it deserves to be told all the way through. Everything that drone eventually passed over in the mud started with one wealthy man's bet that he could get away with something. In 1860, a mobile Alabama businessman named Timothy Mear wagered that he could still smuggle captive Africans across the Atlantic and land them on American soil, more than 50 years after that exact trade had been outlawed by Congress. He handed a ship captain named William Foster roughly $9,000 in gold, and a two-masted schooner called the Clotilda, a vessel actually built for hauling lumber, quietly fitted underneath its deck with a hidden space no lumber inspector would ever think to search. That false wall is the same one underwater cameras would eventually find still standing in the mud 160 years later. It was built right there in Mobile, before the ship ever left for Africa. Foster left Mobile on March 4th with a crew of 12 men who had no real idea what the voyage was actually for. He sailed to the West African port of Ouida in the Kingdom of Dahomey, in what's now the country of Benin, and found a holding pen local traders called a barracoon, a compound where people already captured inland were kept until a buyer arrived. That same holding pen would later be measured, board for board, by researchers who never expected to find it described in any surviving record at all. One of the young men held inside that barracoon was named Cossola. He was 19 years old, the second son of his father's second wife, and that spring he'd been training to become a soldier, the way young men in his town were expected to. Learning to defend a community he assumed he'd spend his life protecting. He never got that chance. Soldiers serving the king of Dahomey attacked his town that April. Cossola, along with more than 100 of his neighbors, was bound and marched for days toward the coast. He spent close to 3 weeks inside that barracoon, on the ground, surrounded by strangers who spoke half a dozen different languages, before he ever laid eyes on the ship that would carry him across an ocean. He didn't know its name yet. Clotilda. Foster was offered somewhere around 125 captives at $100 each. He couldn't take them all. 2 other ships appeared on the horizon, and he believed they might be patrol vessels enforcing the ban on the trade. So he cut the transaction short and pushed off with around 110 people crowded below deck, Cossola among them. The people left standing on that beach were never accounted for again in any record anyone has ever found. What followed was roughly 45 days at sea in a space built to haul lumber, not to hold human beings who needed to breathe, move, and grieve for everyone they just watched vanish behind them. Cossola would say decades later that the worst part wasn't only the hunger and the thirst, though there was plenty of both. It was the humiliation of the entire ordeal, packed below deck with strangers, with no way to know if the ocean would ever end. He'd had a home, he'd had a mother, he'd had a future he'd already been training for. None of it traveled with him onto that ship. The Clotilda reached Mobile Bay on a Sunday in July 1860, and that's when Meher and Foster ran straight into the problem they'd been trying to outrun the entire voyage. A ship that size, carrying that many people, could be seen, could be boarded, could become evidence in a courtroom. So, under cover of darkness, Foster steered the schooner into a hidden channel of the river north of the city, well away from anywhere an official might be watching. The captives were moved onto a smaller riverboat, and once that transfer was complete, Foster set his own ship on fire. He watched it burn down to the waterline. He watched it sink into the mud near a stretch of river known as 12 Mile Island. He believed the current and the silt would finish what the fire started, that the only physical proof of the crime would simply disappear from the world forever. For 160 years, he was right. Rumors about the voyage never fully went away. Meher, Foster, and a third man eventually faced legal action over it. The only price any of them actually paid was a fine of $1,000, levied against Foster alone, for conspiring to bring captives into the country illegally. The Civil War began the following spring, and in the chaos of it, the case was simply set aside and forgotten. Nobody who orchestrated the Clotilda's voyage ever truly answered for what happened to the roughly 110 people locked below its deck. $1,000. That was the entire price of it, on paper. Cossola and the others were divided up between Meher, his brothers, and the associates who'd helped finance the trip. He was given to Meher's brother James, who couldn't pronounce his name and told him he'd answer to Cudjoe instead. Cudjoe Lewis lived enslaved on the Meher property for 5 years, until emancipation finally reached Alabama at the end of the Civil War. When freedom came, he and the other survivors of that crossing found themselves in a country with no plan for what should happen to them next. No money to sail home, no legal claim to the land they'd already worked for free. So they did something with almost no precedent in American history. A community of people who had all crossed the same ocean on the same ship, who all remembered the same raids and the same barracoon, pooled together what little they could earn and bought land north of Mobile with their own hands. They called it Africantown, known today as Africatown. It would not be the last time they had to fight for that ground. Some of the people living there right now can trace their family line directly back to the men and women who came off that ship. Freedom arrived with nothing attached to it. Everything after that, they built themselves. Cudjoe Lewis outlived nearly everyone else who'd crossed with him, though not everyone. Two women who made that same crossing, Radoshi and Matilda McCreer, actually outlived him by years, one into the late 1930s, the other into 1940. For most of the 20th century, Cudjoe Lewis was remembered as the last living person ever taken from Africa on a slave ship. It took researchers decades of digging through plantation and county records to learn that even that piece of the story was incomplete. In the late 1920s, in his final years, Cudjoe sat on his porch and told his story to a young writer named Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote it down almost exactly the way he spoke it. Her manuscript wouldn't reach the public for another 90 years. By the time it finally did, Cudjoe Lewis had been gone for more than 8 decades, and the ship that brought him to America still hadn't been found. Word of what really happened on that voyage never fully disappeared, even without a ship to prove it. Historians argued over whether the community's own account of the story was even accurate. The descendants never needed convincing. What changed in the 1990s was a decision to actually go looking for something you could hold in your hands. It did not go well for a long time. Searchers chased wreck after wreck that turned out to be something else entirely. In 2018, a local journalist named Ben Raines found a large wooden hull during an unusually low tide. And for a few days, Africatown believed the search was finally over. Then marine archaeologists ruled it out. Wrong size, no fire damage, one more false alarm in a long line of them. Raines did not stop there. That same spring, he went back out with a survey team from the University of Southern Mississippi, mapping a stretch of river nobody had studied closely before. 11 separate wrecks turned up on their equipment. 10 of them were clearly something else. The 11th barely registered on the sonar at all. An unremarkable smear the team almost skipped entirely, a shape that looked from above like nothing more than a pile of logs. Raines went into the water alone. Visibility in that stretch of river is close to nothing, so he was working almost entirely by feel. He got hold of one of those logs and pulled. Nothing happened at first. He pulled again, harder, and this time it gave way in his hands. But it didn't come apart the way rotted wood comes apart. This held together, dense and heavy, like something that had been built on purpose rather than something the river had simply worn down over all that time. When he got a proper look at what he was holding, he could see hand-forged iron still driven through the grain, exactly the kind of fastening used in schooners built along the Gulf Coast in the 1850s. The wood around it was scorched, not rotted by the river current, burned. He called up to the boat and told the crew what he was holding. Within seconds, every one of them was in the water beside him. When they finally measured the dimensions against Meare's own insurance filings on the Clotilda, filed before it ever left for Africa, everything lined up exactly. 86 feet long, 23 feet across the beam, white oak and yellow pine, precisely as described in paperwork well over 100 years old. In May of 2019, the Alabama Historical Commission made the announcement that Africatown had been waiting 5 generations to hear. The Clotilda had been found. That was not the end of the story. It was the point where the real search actually began. A wreck buried in river silt for that long can't simply be lifted out and set on dry land. Pulling it apart would destroy exactly what everyone had spent decades trying to recover. So archaeologists working with the Alabama Historical Commission and a research firm called Search Incorporated sent remotely operated cameras down into water, too dark and too dangerous for a diver to work in safely for long, mapping the hull piece by piece using sonar. What those cameras found stopped the team on the surface cold. Investigators eventually estimated that as much as 2/3 of the ship's wooden structure had survived, far more than anyone had reason to expect from a vessel that had been deliberately set on fire. The bulkheads Foster's crew had built to convert a lumber schooner into a slave ship were still standing in the mud. The modifications were still measurable, board by board. Archaeologists could trace exactly where inside that hold roughly 110 human beings had been confined for a crossing that lasted more than a month and a half. The enclosed space measured about 26 feet, 3 inches long. The ceiling stood less than 7 feet high. 110 people, 45 days. Nobody on that monitoring team needed a historian to explain what that number actually meant. The room on the surface went quiet in a way none of them expected going into the dive. It's considered, in the professional judgment of the man who led the research, the most intact slave ship ever found anywhere on Earth. That's not an exaggeration for effect. Jim Delgado, the maritime archaeologist, who led the research for Search Incorporated, is the one who said it. He's also said plainly that watching the footage come back in real time, seeing the physical proof of exactly what Foster's crew had built into that hull, was one of the most sobering moments of his entire career. Not a shipwreck survey anymore, but a crime scene that had waited generations for someone to finally look directly at it. For the people of Africatown, the discovery didn't change what they already believed about their own history. They never doubted it. What it gave them instead was something the rest of the country could no longer wave away as legend or folklore. Joyce Davis, a descendant of one of the men who survived that crossing, has said the ship itself was never what made the story real for her personally. The documents, the names, the records, the books already written about her ancestors, that had already done it. The ship, in her words, was the icing on the cake. A bust of Cudjoe Lewis still stands outside the church he helped build in Africatown. A heritage museum sits nearby now, built specifically to hold pieces of this story for the public to see. The wreck itself has stayed exactly where it was found. Every expert who has studied it agrees that raising it would destroy far more history than it would ever put on public display. It rests today in the same mud that hid it for 160 years, except now it has a name, exact measurements, and a story that can never again be dismissed as something the community only imagined. But the discovery did not undo what happened to the community living above that water in the decades since. The fight for that ground never really ended. In the decades after Africatown was founded, the land its people had bought with their own labor was slowly hemmed in by heavy industry, paper mills, chemical plants, and a highway eventually cut straight through the middle of the settlement. Those same descendants have spent years fighting for basic answers about the air and soil quality around their own homes. Finding the ship proved the past. It didn't fix the present. Millions of people were carried across the Atlantic during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, and the overwhelming majority of the ships that carried them have never been found, and likely never will be. What sets the Clotilda apart isn't only that its hull survived the very fire meant to erase it, it's that the community founded by the people who were actually on board also survived, in that same place, for 160 years, never once needing the mud to confirm what they already knew to be true. It's worth understanding a bit more about the world Kosola was actually taken from, because that part of the story often gets flattened into just a few lines. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what's now Benin, was a powerful West African state at the time, and it had built a significant part of its economy and military strength around raiding neighboring communities and selling captives to European and American traders operating along the coast. Kosola belonged to the Yoruba people, specifically a subgroup called the Isha, whose traditional homeland sat in the region Dahomey's forces were actively raiding that particular year. This wasn't some isolated, random act of violence. It reflected a much larger, brutal economic system that had already been operating along that stretch of West African coastline for centuries by the time the Clotilda ever arrived, one that a wealthy Alabama businessman was now looking to exploit one final time, decades after his own country had officially outlawed participating in it. It's also worth spending a bit more time on what actually happened during those 45 days at sea, since the sheer physical reality of that crossing is easy to lose inside a single summary sentence. The hold Foster had built into the Clotilda was designed to carry lumber, meaning it had never been intended to provide breathable air, clean water, or sanitation for over 100 living people, packed closely together for well over a month. Historical accounts of similar Middle Passage crossings describe conditions of extreme heat, sickness, and death, and survivors of the Clotilda specifically describe the psychological toll as being just as devastating as the physical hardship, the complete uncertainty of not knowing where they were going, whether they'd ever see anyone from home again, or whether the ship itself would ever actually stop moving. Kosola later specifically emphasized the humiliation of the experience alongside the physical suffering, being treated as cargo rather than as a person with an entire life and identity that had existed just weeks earlier. It's also worth going a little deeper into what happened to Africatown across the 20th century, because the story doesn't simply end with the community successfully buying land after emancipation. For several decades, Africatown genuinely thrived as a self-governing community, with its own school, churches, and local businesses, largely built and run by the descendants of the Clotilda survivors themselves. But starting in the early 20th century, industrial development along the Mobile River began encroaching steadily on the community's land. Paper mills and chemical processing plants were built directly adjacent to residential areas, and in the 1990s, an interstate highway was constructed running straight through the middle of what had been the historic heart of the community, physically dividing it and displacing a number of longtime residents in the process. Environmental studies conducted in more recent decades have documented elevated rates of certain health conditions among Africatown residents, which advocates and researchers have connected specifically to the concentration of industrial facilities surrounding the community, sitting immediately next to homes that, in some cases, have been owned by the same families for 5 or 6 generations. It's worth mentioning, too, that the Clotilda's rediscovery has connected to a broader wave of renewed attention paid to Africa Town specifically over the past several years. A documentary called Descendant, covering the community's story and the ship's discovery, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later released more widely, and a heritage museum called the Africa Town Heritage House opened in 2023, specifically built to hold and display artifacts and exhibits related to the Clotilda's story and the broader history of the community founded by its survivors. Some of Africa Town's descendants have gone on to real public prominence in other fields entirely, including the musician Amir Questlove Thompson, who has spoken publicly about his own family's direct connection to the original Clotilda survivors. It's genuinely worth acknowledging, too, that the Mir family, whose ancestor financed the entire illegal voyage in the first place, still owns significant property in the area today, including land directly adjacent to where the wreck itself was ultimately found. That detail adds a real, uncomfortable layer of complexity to the discovery, though physical evidence of one of the last documented crimes of the American slave trade sitting in the mud next to property still held by the direct descendants of the man who financed it in the first place. Eventually, the drone was brought back to the surface. Above the water, the mobile river goes on the same way it did the night Foster set that ship on fire, certain he was erasing something forever. Below it, the hull he thought would simply vanish into the mud is still resting exactly where it sank, except now it's been seen, measured, and named. Researchers have already pulled a wood core sample from a corner of that hold, testing it for traces of DNA old enough to potentially link directly to living descendants today. Those results are still pending as of now. The mud may not be finished, giving up everything it's held onto for so long. Africa Town was never actually waiting on an answer to know their own history was real. If a story like this one was carried inside your own family for generations, long before the rest of the world was ready to believe it, you already understand exactly why this discovery matters as much as it does. Subscribe if you think history like this deserves to be told in full, not just in passing, because there's a lot more of it still waiting to be uncovered, and we're going to keep digging into it right here.